You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. It's Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com, thechrisvossshow.com. Welcome to the big show. We've got the cracking voice there. What's going on? Clearly, my going to have to go back to my opera teacher and get some work done on that. Anyway, guys, as always, refer the show to your family, friends, and relatives, because if you haven't, you're not honoring your downline and your obligations to the Chris Voss Show. You need to be inviting at least 5 of your friends, relatives, and neighbors to subscribe. No, I'm just kidding. You don't have to do that. You can just enjoy the show. Seriously, people. It's a joke, but it is a way to segue into the plugs. The plugs, as we like to call them. The youtube.com/Chris Voss, goodreads.com/Chris Voss, and linkedin.com Chris Voss. Repeat after me. Tell people to subscribe to the show. Give us 5 stars over there on iTunes, and we love you. Is that enough begging and grifting and whatever else I can do on the show? There you go. There's the plugs. Anyway, guys, we have an amazing author on the show. I'm excited to talk to him about his book, because his book is a journey that I think a lot of us go on in our lives, where we kind of reach a point, and I think it comes from in maturity too, where we start to reckon, who we are. Where have we been? Where do we come from? Who are the people in our lives? And what are the indelible imprints that they've left on our souls, on our making, our creation? We start to really kind of ponder that. Why are we here? And who the hell were those people that got us here? And so I think this will be a great discussion. He is the author of the newest book that came out February 21st, 2023. Emmanuel Iduma is on the show with us today. His book is called I Am Still With You, A Reckoning with Silence, Inheritance, in History. And he talks about his journey of going back and trying to find his past, and what went into his past and how he got there. He was born in Nigeria in 1989. Iduma studied law at OAU in Nigeria, and he received his MFA in art criticism and writing from the School of Visual Arts, New York, USA. He's the author of the travelogue, Stranger's Pose, 2018, which was longlisted for the 2019 prize. His nonfiction and criticism have appeared in Aperture, Art in America, Art Forum, Granta, N+1, the New York Review of Books, the Yale Review, and other publications. Welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing very well. It's nice to be here, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you for coming to the show. We really appreciate it, Emmanuel. Give us your .com so people can find you on the interwebs, please.
My website is emmanueliduma.com, and you can go there and have access to a lot of the work that I've done.
There you go. And how many books have you written so far?
So this is the third book that I've written. The first was a novel that was published many years ago in Nigeria, and then the second is A Stranger's Pose, and this is the third book that I've written. Yeah.
There you go. So what motivated you want to write this book?
Many things, and on many levels. The first level was that I've always been, of course, fascinated by the Nigerian history, partly because, growing up, it wasn't very available in a sense in my curriculum. And so once I became conscious that I wanted to be a writer, I also became equally conscious that I needed to think through, the histories that had shaped me in some way. And the Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War, is certainly perhaps the biggest event in Nigeria's post-colonial history. And that was always fascinating to me for many reasons, but I think more consequentially was the fact that my uncle, or one of my uncles, who I was named after, went to fight in the war on the Biafran side and did not come back. And no one sort of knew what happened to him after the war ended. and people began to return home. And so I knew that in some way I wanted to write about who he was. I mean, I didn't know how to do that until my father passed, and I felt, this is the perfect moment, well, an imperfect moment, so to speak, to begin that journey, because I also wanted to deal with my father's life, but to sort of deal with it through my uncle's life, so to speak. Yeah.
There you go. And I think this is a moment, I assume it's a moment many people go through in their lives. It happened to me and happened to you and other things where we kind of start to reflect on things. We kind of wonder, like, there's a time where I think we take maybe our parents for granted and the relatives in our lives. And then there's a time where they start to disappear, or they start disappearing. Yeah. And we start to going, who formed me? Why did they form me? Why were they motivated by what they did? What was their journeys? And that's the beauty of what I love about the show, is we get to talk about other people's journeys, because mine's boring as hell. And I'm sick of it. So I imagine you kind of went through the same sort of cathartic moment, especially after the loss of your father, of wondering, who am I, and what got me here, and who are these other people?
Yeah, I completely agree with that assessment. I think, as someone said, I can't remember who exactly, that we lose our childhoods twice. The first time when we grow up and become adults, and the second time when our parents die.
Wow. And
and it's such a powerful concept, because for people whose parents live until say they are 90, you could say, oh, they had a very long childhood, but for me, both my parents passed by the time I was 30. It's a relatively short, quote unquote, childhood. But that's besides the point, or that's in addition to the fact that for me, thinking about, as I said, my father's life, or trying to make sense of it, really was what drove me to reflecting on other lives in my family, such as my uncle. And I feel like this is an important place to make the point that, for me, as I imagine for many people, you don't really get a lot. Right. You don't get a resolution, even if you had reams of documents, that even if your parents, say, wrote a memoir, right? You don't necessarily have access to every single thing that might be noteworthy to you, so to speak. And so the question then becomes, how do you deal with the limits of what you know?
Yeah.
And that's what the book became. Yeah. Or what you don't know. Exactly. Yeah. And that's what the book, I feel like, ultimately becomes, in my own thinking right now.
And so how would you describe your book? Would you describe it as a memoir, as a journey, a story? How do you describe it?
Well, yeah, I just to say as a caveat that, every time or at least after my last book, I set out to write a more and a book that could be easily categorized. And in the initial conception of this book, it was supposed to unfold simply as a journey. I move from place to place and discover things and narrate it upon discovery. But when I really went on the journey that informed the book, I felt that initial journey didn't really, help me discover a lot of things, or, there wasn't any big revelation at the end of the journey. So the question then became, how do I structure the book in such a way that the reader doesn't get frustrated by the dead ends and, the incompleteness of the journey or of the story? And so the book, I think, in a very broad sense, is a memoir, because I'm writing about my life. I'm writing about my past. But it's also, as the subtitle says, a reckoning with history. So there's a lot of historical information that is included that doesn't necessarily have to do with my life personally. There's also, really some commentary on Nigerian politics, and really was an attempt for me to make sense of what I had discovered, both in my journey and also in the sense of what what the history of the war was. And I think that when you combine memoir and reportage and, some kind of commentary, you get a sense of what the book is.
Yeah. And to me, this is a cathartic human experience. I remember when I lost my father, and the time was coming. He was winding down. He was constantly in the hospital. It became apparent that it was just a matter of time. And so I started sitting down with him and doing what I call the house cleaning, making sure there was no bad blood between us, making sure that any things that we needed to resolve were cleared at the table. And I tried to collect from him as many ideas as he could, but he was starting to go into dementia. But this is, as a man, and I don't know what it's like to be a woman, so I'm not going to pretend somebody can fill that in the blank in the audience as a woman. But I think if a woman loses their mother, it's a very impactful experience. But as a man, when you lose your father, or both your parents, you become alone in the world. It becomes you. And up until then, you're kind of, I don't know if coasting is the right word, but I kind of always felt like I was like, well, you know what? He's still here, so I'm going to still be here. And I'll deal with some things when, maybe it's just me. And then suddenly you find yourself alone in the world. Yeah. And you're like, who am I and where am I going? And like you mentioned, it's not really about the destination, because the destination is the journey, what you're learning. And sometimes at the end of these cathartic journeys that we go on, there is no right answer. There is no final thing where there's an epiphany moment where it's like, ta-da, here's the prize at the end of the thing. You kind of reach a point where you have to come to some sort of cathartic reasoning or conclusion your end. Have I framed that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you are very right that the nature of life, or even thinking about life, whether it's ours or that of others, is not it's not linear. I don't want to use the word messy, but it's certainly
mine was messy.
It's certainly it's certainly non-linear. Let's just use that word.
And mine's still messy. I'm still making a mess.
and especially in relation to people who cannot speak back, right? This is the real thing in relation to that the other thing that I've been thinking about is that the most honest form of conversation, I think I saw this in a poem, is with the dead is silence, right? And so what happens, and this is why silence is in the subtitle of the book, what happens when the dead are keeping to themselves? And I had to be clear that what I was what I was doing in my writing was sort of my own reasoning in relation to my father's life. I didn't think that I was writing, even though I was as close to him as I was writing anything authoritative about his person, about his travails. Part of the most important thing to me, or the most cathartic thing, if I would use that word, or memorable thing at the end of writing, was that there was a lot that I didn't know, and that was fine. Because I didn't want to present, and even for the reader, I hope that I've presented something that doesn't seem like it's too obsessed with knowing, as much as the kind of conversation, for instance, that we are having is the point of the book, to create this frame where conceptual concepts around knowing, around inheritance and all of that can be, the reader and I can have that conversation.
There you go. And I love that. I love how you frame that, because this is a journey I think most people go into when you're young and you're kind of immortal. You don't really care. You're living your life. You're chasing around. And then there's kind of a moment where you start to slow down and go, wait, who the hell am I? And you start looking in that mirror harsher. So you grow up, you're born and raised in Nigeria, and then eventually you come to New York. How does that transpire? And then when do you make the decision to go back?
Oh yeah, a very good question. I went to university in Nigeria. I trained as a lawyer and then went to law school. I mean, I went to law school in Nigeria. I mean, so right after university, which is a 5-year period in Nigeria, you go for a 1-year mandatory period if you want to become a lawyer. And so after that, I'd sort of known almost early on in my undergraduate days that I wasn't sure I was going to practice law. It was a clarity I had for whatever reason. I had nothing to do with whether or not I was compelled to study law or any of that. I just felt that my interest, there was a greater interest in being a writer or figuring out what it meant to being a writer than, say, practicing law. So once I finished law school, I had to figure out a way to make this work, right? Career wise, money wise and all that. And so I got involved with an organization that would make road trips from Lagos in Nigeria to other parts of the African continent, which was in a sense, the basis of my previous book. And after that, when I was in one of those countries, I met someone who recommended that I, go study in New York because he felt that what I was writing was art criticism and there was a program that could help me sharpen that. And so this was it. I applied for the program at the School of Visual Art and got in. And just sort of stayed for the next 7 years, or 2 years for the master's and 5 years afterwards, just sort of making it work right in New York. But when my father passed, it just became clear to me that around that time I had also got into a relationship that was also leading to marriage, and I just felt, this is not a place I want to spend the rest of my life or, start a family. And so Nigeria appealed to me for the fact that I was returning home. I was returning to my family. I was returning to start a family, but also because, and secondarily, it was also the place where I felt I could tease out these interests, such as the history of Nigeria, the history of the Biafran War. And I didn't think that I could write a book like this if I hadn't recommitted to living in Nigeria full time.
Mm-hmm. And this is an interesting journey going. I should, jumping back a little bit, I still often think about my father. I think about his motivations. I think about what he was trying to do, what he was trying to think. I wrote the other day on Facebook that I probably owe my father a few apologies and a little bit more respect for what he went through as I've gone through my journey. I'm going through his old age right now that he was in when I had my largest interactions with him post childhood. And so you go back to Nigeria, and how do you go on this journey? Why do you choose your uncle? I think it's kind of obvious, but I'd love to hear it from you. And what does this journey entail? I mean, certainly there's some complexity to it and history.
Yeah. So, I mean, I choose my uncle. I should just reiterate if that wasn't clear. My uncle is the person I was named after. One of his names is my name, Emmanuel. His name was Emmanuel. I mean, this was, I write it in more detail in the book. It was one of the names that he was known by, but became my first name. And so, for me, because I had for many years been collecting, books, buying books about the war, trying to research it just for intellectual curiosity. And I sort of knew I would write a book, or I wanted to write something about it. I wasn't sure what. And it just occurred to me one day that, the story that I'm trying to tell in relation to the war is in relation to my uncle. And so the journey is, I didn't have any, there's no place there's no archive where I could find his name or whatever. It was really structured around talking to relatives, going to my hometown, but also traveling to parts of Nigeria where the war had been fought. My idea was, very conceptual, very, very indirect, was, if I could visit some of the places where the last battles of the war had been fought, since I had heard from my father that he was last seen in the last year of the war. He was seen in the last year of the war. So I thought, okay, I'm going to think around or travel to places where the last battles of the war was fought and just be there, right? There was nobody that I was going to meet there that would immediately know my uncle. This is like a 50 plus year period. But I also wanted to understand how the war was being remembered or talked about in those places. So on one hand, I'm traveling to talk to my relatives or my father's friends, who had been friends with him from childhood. But also, in addition to that, I'm traveling to places that meant something in relation to the war, and bringing those two kinds of journeys together. So I travel to one place to meet a relative. I travel to another place to, to just sort of talk to people or try to visit places that were important for the war effort.
Let me ask you this: did you hope to find maybe he might be alive? Maybe might he give you some insight, or did you were you were interested in what you mentioned before, walking through his shoes and the experience? And just kind of trying to feel maybe what he felt or experienced or think maybe some of the things he thought.
Well, I mean, I sort of knew that it would be almost impossible that he would still be alive, right? So the fact, and which would have been a more dramatic story, of course, if I had sort of met him somewhere. And that's because, for two reasons. One is that my father had always been, made this statement over the years when he was alive that, what if one day he just returned, right? Which was, of course, I mean, that's what happens when people disappear, really, because their bodies are not present. You just sort of keep imagining. But on the other hand, it was clear to me from my interaction with people who were old enough to have been, alive during the war, that people who went, regardless of how far people went back, part of what happened in the first year or within the first year, sometimes weeks, months, even a year or two, was that people find their way back to their hometowns, regardless of how long it had taken. So for someone who spent all that time, I mean, if he was alive and in his right mind, right, he would have certainly come back. Also because, part of what usually happened was that when the person didn't return after a bit of time, a symbolic burial will be held for the person, because there were all these beliefs about the person's spirits that needed to be sent out properly and all that. And so I think that by the middle of the journey, or by actually pretty much early into the journey, it was clear to me that what I was doing was trying to understand what had happened to him. Really, that was the big question. What could have happened to this person, and how could I find that out?
There you go. And the journey of going through it all and trying to walk in their footsteps. It's interesting how we go through times in our life. And I think this is what your book illustrates, where we try and go home. And I've learned the hard way, you can never really go home.
Yeah.
It's different. And you go, like when I went back several times to my neighborhood as a child, and I walked the streets as I did as a child, and I tried to get a feel of what that was and try to relive the experience a little bit, or come to some sort of cathartic moment, or see if there was something there. It was the journey of the experience. And there was a lot of similarities, but yet there is things a lot of different. And but still it's interesting because you're going on an emotional or intellectual, I think it's both, a journey within your own mind. You're trying to walk through people's experiences. And why did my parents choose what they did? Why did they, what shaped them? And thereby what shaped them also shaped me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So very interesting.
Yeah. I think that, the idea that we could recover a sense of the past. It's always fascinating to us for many reasons. I mean, the present is usually has a degree of complexity, right? Dealing with everyday life. The future is sometimes, aspirational and in also in some cases hard to imagine. But the past is settled in that sense. So if it's settled, it's therefore in our minds recoverable, or we can recover part of it. And so I think that there is always a fascination for many writers I know, to return into their childhood or the places that inform their childhood. But the question is, with what eyes are you returning? As someone said, the past past must only be entered into illegally. It doesn't issue visas. So the question is, what angle or with what forged papers do we enter the past? And when you for instance go to the places or the streets where you grew up, what you're certainly seeing is through an adult's eye. How do you imagine yourself as a child with the language of an adult, right? That's the issue, right? That we can't quite return to the language we had as children. We are always sort of thinking about our childhood because we are now adults and using the language of adulthood to frame what our childhood was. And so the only people that really know us as children are our parents. That's who, in the sense of even just the daily lives that we lived. For us, it's something to recover. For them, it's something they lived through with some degree of certainty.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but and I love what you're saying. This is also a journey of a war, of a nation that's given freedom from the oppression of the United Kingdom's colonization of Nigeria in 1960, where it turns over. There's a coup. It's a bloody, horrific, ethnic civil war that has all the horrors of war, and in a way, your uncle was taken from you and stolen from you by the events of this war. And it's almost kind of like the journey that we go on. There's the famous movie Citizen Kane, where at the end his final words are Rosebud, and everyone's like, "What is Rosebud?" And it was something that he lost, or something that was taken from him as a child. You of course learn in the movie, and that's kind of correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of the journey of you're trying to find something that was taken from you, and the history behind that, and why it was taken from you, and what happened with it, and the journey of the history of a country and a people, which is also your identity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because history, I mean, for me, the history had to become invariably personal, in the sense that I was not looking at this history or I wasn't writing about this history to simply just recount what happened. But as you say, what happened to me in relation to this history. I felt that this was the only way it mattered, really. Otherwise, I wasn't alive then. One can only imagine what it meant for people who were alive then. And, in fact, most people who are alive then have difficulties talking about it, just because of how difficult it was, right? And how traumatic it is. And I think the idea that they need to say everything or deal with it, I don't necessarily agree. I mean, I feel like people can also deal with things by being quiet about it, But that's a different conversation. But I mean that for me, in writing this book, it was clear that the history had to become personal. I had to engage with it in a way that felt meaningful to me.
And I think this is a great example, and why stories and authors and books like you've written, they're life lessons. We don't get a life manual in this world. And so stories are the ways that we learn, whether it's through film, books, TV, whatever it is, the stories, that's kind of our life lessons and manuals. And we learn from each other. Oh, you went through this. Well, maybe I need to go on that journey, or maybe this is similar to something I experienced. And it's the human experience when it really comes down to it. You're trying to find your way, and it's a family experience. It's a personal experience. It's a father, mother, paternal, maternal experience. It's a nation experience it's a human experience that we're going through, and we're trying to find ourselves. Why are we here? What does this mean? What happens after? What got me here? What was the motivations? And so I think that's the beauty of stories like this, and why it's important that we, try and find what this all means, and it adds to the beauty of the breadth and tapestry of life. And there's no really destination. It's all about the journey. And maybe someday, I don't know, maybe someday before you die, you come to some sort of conclusion to it all. I don't know that anyone does. Maybe that's the point of it all.
That's the point of the afterlife. Yeah.
That's the point of it all. You experience it. It was really hard for me when I was young when people would say it's about the journey, Chris, not the destination. I want to punch him in the face all the time. It used to make me visceral. But then I got enough kicks in the ass from life. What more do you want to tease out of the book? Because we definitely want them to pick it up and read it and go on the journey with you.
I mean, what more do I want to tease out? That's a good point.
Or anything we haven't touched on?
Yeah, I think that part of what is important for me, or what was important for me in writing the book, was also to underscore how the historical is not far from the present moment. And so, for instance, there were the war was fought between a country that, or a region that declared itself independent, called itself Biafra, with the Nigerian federal government. And now, at least since 1999, in a concerted way, there's been groups that are advocating for Biafra again. And in the last, I would say, in the last 7 years, it has gotten a little bit more intense with a more militant group called the indigenous people of Biafra. And in my writing this book, I knew that I wasn't writing a book about that movement for sure. It would take more time and, certainly more access that I didn't have. But I wanted to make the connection between how the war is talked about or not talked about with, the fact that people feel emboldened to clamor for a return to, or, the reinstatement, or, a fresh move into Biafra. But the larger point was, how do you ensure that you don't think in pockets of events, right? Or just think that something that happens in a country is isolated. How do you make connections across the history of a country? And for me, that was very important to do,
Yeah. And, you've given me epiphany. A lot of, not only from what we've talked about for a personal journey of personal identity, a lot of people are on this journey with their nations or their politics or whatever. Yeah. Nigeria, as you mentioned, is on this. Some people have a romanticism to the past, to a certain thing, that maybe something was better back then. I've often found that, like I said, you can't go home. It's never wasn't as romantic as you thought it was. But there's sometimes that idealism. Your country, Nigeria, has been through civil wars and battles, and fought over identity, and maybe possibly return to the past, as you mentioned. Africa as a continent has, from colonialization and the removal of colonialization, has been fighting for their identity and what they feel might be prevalent. My country, America, your country too. We fought a civil war over our identity. We're still kind of fighting a civil war over that identity. January 6th, there was the Confederate flag of losers in our capital once again in a fight for, a clawback to what some people feel was a better time, which it wasn't. I lived there. I lived through some of that. Yeah, we should go back to the old days. They weren't that great. And they weren't great for everybody. And that's what we should have, is a world that's great for everybody. But it's interesting to me, you give me epiphany that not only are people searching for that identity and reconciliation of who they are through the past, it is also a journey of nations.
Yeah, I mean, it's so, you put it so brilliantly. I feel like, I mean, of course, historians, and this is the task of historians, to sort of articulate a story that is not just the story of an individual, right? To think about it from a more collective perspective. But if we think about our lives, as I often do, as as tributaries in a sea of stories, right? The question is that the fact is that it's almost like a network of stories, right? So the story of the individual within a family, within a country, or in my case, within an ethnic group, within a country, within and then gets bigger and bigger like that. Stories can be told on all those levels, and that is equally what I feel like. Of course, each country has to keep negotiating that. Mm-hmm. How do we tell a story? I mean, of course, for instance, in America, where some stories are not being told, or some people feel that some stories are not being told, others feel like, you should include the story, right? Or stop telling the story. And it goes on and on with this negotiation of what should be told. What is collective enough as a story? What is national enough as a story? And I feel, that as long as we keep looking for those big universal stories, mm-hmm. That can represent every single person, would keep having the same kind of issues that we're having, say, in most countries, really. Because the story, and this is the final and the main point, that the story is inherently individual. We of course will latch onto collective stories to make sense of our individual stories, but we really always come down to it, from an individual point. So, which is why most people who participate in big political movements, sort of, you can tell a story of how their lives led to that moment or that participation. Mm-hmm. And it's not just this big story that, the news would like to make it like, oh, this person did this. Mm-hmm. There is always the individual story in which the bigger story plays, or that is part of the bigger story, so to speak. Yeah.
There you go. It reminds me of something that William Barr said. Attorney William Barr said that history is written by the winners, and he may be quoting someone else, but that's not the true history. That's the winner's version of the history, and they get to dictate it, which was kind of his point in a very negative sense. But it gives me thought that there's a downside to that. There's a negative side. There's other stories. There's other people's experiences that can be highlighted, that can be talked about. I just had the author of the book, The Case for Cancel Culture, on the show, and we're talking about our culture that we have nowadays of victimhood and everything. And I had an epiphany after the show that, sometimes it's not so much that we need to be calling out or claiming that we're the victim of something. Mm-hmm. More so what it needs to be is that we're trying to tell our story, that we're trying to tell our experiences to each other so that we understand each other better, so that we empathize with each other better. You're educating me, and I've learned a lot actually about the Civil War. I've learned that Doctors Without Borders came out of this. I learned a lot of NGOs came out of this. That I believe, that TV guy you see late at night who goes, $1 will save children in Africa. A lot of these organizations came out of this whole area.
Yeah.
It's a lesson of when colonization or powers removed and a nation falls into civil war. We did that in Iraq with the American government. We took it over. We had no idea that technically the thing that was keeping everybody in line was Saddam Hussein, and we removed him. The different ethnic groups went at each other, and so it's a lesson of history and life and stuff. But really, we're all trying to tell our story and make sure that people understand us. And the reason we're doing that isn't so much a narcissism as it is to where, it's important that we learn from these stories and the experiences of others, and that we understand each other and that we empathize with each other and we understand each other's journeys. Does that sound crazy, or am I?
No, that's very apt. That's well put, actually.
I'm on a journey today of something. I'm going to learn.
The first point you made about history being written by the winners, and which is, it might sound cliched now, but it's so true. Every cliche has a gem of truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the ways in which that was sort of, made apparent in Nigeria's, in the aftermath of the war, was that there was this statement that was bandied around by the government, and I think it could be well-meaning. It was no victor, no vanquished, right? This idea that everyone, sort of in the spirit of reconciliation, no one should be considered a victor, no one should be considered vanquished, right? But I when I'm thinking about it in retrospect now, I'm saying, oh yeah, that's of course what the winner would say.
Yeah.
The winner says, oh, no one was vanquished, right? The winner would say, I won, therefore I make the rules on how the war is talked about, right?
Yeah. And in your country, in Nigeria, when it gained freedom from the United Kingdom, this is October 1st, 1960. It had a population of 45.2 million, and there were 300 differing ethnic groups and cultural groups, which is a lot to try and get everybody to all get along.
Yeah.
And so three of the largest ethnic groups, start, warring battles with each other. We had the same problem we're going through the same problem now with the birth of America, where the winners of the, of white settlers who came here and enslaved and attacked and destroyed many of the Native Americans that were here and African Americans. We've been told kind of a whitewash story for 200, almost 50 years, and of the winners rule, and that wasn't always true. And we're finding out now that we're having these discussions and we're exposing stories, and I've learned a lot from great authors we've had on the show that have talked about other people's experiences that weren't the winners in that thing. But in truth, it's not really about winners and losers. It's about hearing each other, understanding each other, and getting along as a community of human beings, and making sure that everyone at least is recognized, the story is heard, or is at least dealt with in a matter of empathy.
Yeah.
And we care. And so it's the constant battle for those stories and finding out who we are, whether it's a person or a nation or a being or a group or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
Anything more you want to tease out on the book before we go?
No, it's I guess finally it's also, I do want to point out that for me also, and this finally actually, that writing this book was not just dealing with a tragedy. It was also to find meaning for myself in a hopeful manner in relation to those tragedies. I hope that I have not written a book that is suffused with self-pity. Because the stories don't matter for or the story that I write doesn't matter for its scandalousness or its sentimentality as much as for what it communicates about, I think, the human condition and attempts to make meaning of the past, with the past, and through the past as well. Yeah.
There you go. And an example to all of us. I learned a long time ago. I didn't share stuff sometimes, like when my dogs died and other things that were, I had a lot of feeling or emotion in life. And I found that by sometimes sharing that stuff, I helped other people. I remember when I shared the death of my dog with people, that it was cathartic for other people. They were like, wow, I didn't realize you didn't have closure until you talked about the loss of your father or the loss of your dogs and the experience that you went through. That to me, I didn't ever want to share because I felt like, oh, I'm just doing a pity party. Poor is me. Wah, wah, wah. And it was amazing to me how much talking about the experience of the human experience was cathartic to other people and helped other people sometimes with closure and reconciling what they went through and stuff like that. And that whole journey of where we start to realize that we feel that we're alone in some things, and we learn that we're not.
Yeah.
We're not. We're part of it. It takes us on a journey where we feel like we're kind of wandering alone in the wilderness, and then we come back and arrive at a point where we find that we're part of the human race, and this is the human experience, and it's that coming back and forth. Kind of an interesting way of doing it. Well, this has been really insightful. I've learned a lot, Emmanuel. In fact, I'm going to go spend some more time watching some videos on this war. I'm always interested in these wars that shaped us and the history of it. And the one thing I always say on the show, the one thing man can learn from his history is man never learns from his history. That's why he's doomed to repeat it. Yeah. So we should always learn. Give us your .com so people can find you on the interwebs.
My website is emmanueliduma.com, and you can find the book really anywhere that books are sold, I think.
There you go. Thank you very much for coming on the show and enlightening us today. You've enlightened
Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah.
Hopefully my audience, and if they're not enlightened, well, then that's their problem. But I learned so much today.
I hope they're enlightened. Yeah.
I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm just going to, go bask in my sexiness because my brain is so much bigger today. I've learned so much stuff. But this is a journey we all go on. I still think about my father to this day. And it was important that I did what you did. I went to find other people who could give me history, because sometimes my father would give me a little bit of PR history. You know what I mean? Sometimes and I think sometimes it wasn't an evil intent. So I think sometimes he was maybe trying to protect himself, but also maybe protect me from the truth a little bit. And so it's important to go learn about your history. Some people do this through genealogy, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, order up the book, folks, wherever fine books are sold. I Am Still With You, A Reckoning with Silence, Inheritance, and History, wherever fine books are sold. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Refer to share your family or friends. Goodreads.com/Chris Voss, YouTube.com/Chris Voss, and LinkedIn/Chris Voss. Thanks for tuning in. Be good to each other. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time. And that's